Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, glad to share this quiet hour with you. Tell me, has the ink on your desk dried yet, or does the page still wait, half-written, beside your cooling tea? Watson kept such pages once, margins full of small truths others burned or buried. Do subscribe so no fragment of the story escapes you. Now, draw near, for as Holmes always held, it is upon trifles that the greatest cases turn. Chapter 1. A Visitor from Lincoln's Inn. It was upon a raw and yellow morning in November, with the fog lying so thickly upon Baker Street that the lamplighters had not troubled to extinguish their lamps before 9 o'clock, that I came down to find Sherlock Holmes already at his chemical table, a spirit lamp hissing before him, and a most villainous odour of sulphuretted hydrogen pervading our sitting-room. "You will forgive the atmosphere, Watson," said he, without turning from his retorts. "I am endeavouring to determine whether a certain ink, when subjected to heat, yields a residue distinguishable from its fellows. It is dull work, but dull work well done has hanged more than one rogue who thought himself clever." I'd scarcely seated myself and unfolded the newspaper when Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door, her expression that of a woman who has admitted, against her better judgment, a visitor whose distress was written plainly upon his countenance. "A Mr. Edmund Carstairs, sir, from Lincoln's Inn. He says the matter will not wait upon convenience." "Then by all means let inconvenience have its way," said Holmes, extinguishing his lamp with a somewhat regretful air and wiping his long fingers upon a cloth. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson." The gentleman who entered was young, not above 30, dressed with the particular neatness that marks the careful solicitor rather than the fashionable one. His collar was correct, his black coat well brushed, and yet his hands, as he removed his gloves, trembled with a nervous energy that no amount of professional composure could entirely master. He introduced himself as junior solicitor to the firm of Bellamy, Harcourt and Vane, of Lincoln's Inn Fields, and begged our pardon for the earliness of his call. "Pray sit by the fire, Mr. Carstairs," said Holmes, "and tell us what has brought a Chancery solicitor out into a November fog before his own clerks have lit their office stoves. I observe you have travelled by hansom rather than by the Underground, though the latter would have been quicker from your chambers, which suggests either that you did not wish to be seen upon a public platform, or that you left in such haste as to hail the first conveyance to hand." Mr. Carstairs looked startled. "The latter, Mr. Holmes, though I confess I do not see how— Your left cuff is inked, but your right is not, which tells me you write with your right hand and rested your left upon a desk this morning before you had thought to blot it. The ink is fresh, not yet a day old. You came, then, directly from your papers to your hat and stick, without the leisure to change your coat. That much is trivial. Now, your business, if you please." Our visitor drew a breath, and the story that followed was told with the precision of a man accustomed to legal statement, though his voice caught more than once upon matters that plainly touched him nearly. "Mr. Holmes, our firm has for some years represented Sir Matthew Ashcombe in a protracted Chancery suit concerning the estate of his late brother, old Josiah Ashcombe. The property in dispute is considerable, certain freehold houses in Bloomsbury and a parcel of agricultural land in Hertfordshire, and the suit has divided the Ashcombe family into two bitter camps for the better part of 4 years. Sir Matthew has always maintained, and I believe with some justice in law if not entirely in equity, that the whole estate descends to him under the terms of his brother's will. Other branches of the family dispute this bitterly." "I have heard something of the Ashcombe litigation," said Holmes. "It has been mentioned in the legal columns as a case of unusual acrimony." "It has been that, sir, and worse. But I come to you this morning because of a specific catastrophe. The principal Chancery bill in the matter, the pleading upon which the whole of Sir Matthew's claim in the current stage of proceeding rests, has been destroyed by fire." "Destroyed how and where?" "It was kept, as such papers commonly are, in a deed box in our strong-room, Mr. Holmes, secured under lock. Yesterday evening it was discovered that the box had been opened. By what means we cannot yet say, for there was no sign of forcing, and the bill itself had been burned, evidently within the room, for a quantity of ash and blackened fragment was found in the grate, though the fire there had not been lit by any of our people that day. Holmes's eyes, which had been half closed, opened fully at this. The grate had not been lit, and yet a fire had burned there. That is interesting. Pray continue. Who had access to this strong room? 3 persons only, beyond the partners themselves. Mrs. Eleanor Ashcombe, Sir Matthew's niece by marriage, a widow, who has of late been assisting in the sorting of certain family papers relevant to the suit. Mr. Felix Vane, our senior partner, who has conducted the litigation throughout, and old Thomas Rudge, our Chancery clerk, who has served the firm faithfully these 30 years and holds keys to every lock upon the premises. And which of these 3, in your private judgment, is most likely to have destroyed the bill? Mr. Carstairs hesitated, and I saw the trouble deepen in his young face. That is precisely what I cannot tell you, Mr. Holmes. Each of them, God help me, appears entirely incapable of it, and yet one of them surely must be guilty. You say the destruction is a catastrophe, yet if certified copies exist elsewhere, as I should suppose they must in any properly conducted Chancery matter, the loss, while inconvenient, need not be fatal to Sir Matthew's case. That is the strangest circumstance of all, sir. Copies do exist, and the case is not lost upon that ground. And yet I cannot escape the conviction that the fire was not meant merely to destroy, but to make us believe that destruction was its whole purpose, when in truth something else entirely was intended. Holmes rose from his chair with the swift, decisive movement I knew so well, and reached for his pipe upon the mantel. "Mr. Carstairs," said he, "you have brought me a fire that burns without a lit grate, 3 suspects who appear incapable of crime, and a destroyed document whose destruction does not destroy. I confess the case has features that recommend it to my attention. Watson, be so good as to fetch the index volume under A. We shall want what is known of Sir Matthew Ashcombe before we call upon him this afternoon." And so began, though I did not then guess at its curious windings, the affair which I have since come to think of in my own private notes as the matter of the burned Chancery Bill. Chapter 2. The Gentleman of Ashcombe House. Ashcombe House stood upon the northern fringe of Regent's Park, a tall and severe building of grey stone whose windows, curtained in dark velvet, seemed to regard the street below with a kind of proprietary disdain. Holmes had spent the better part of the afternoon in silence, his brows drawn together over the index volumes I had fetched him, and it was not until our cab drew up before that forbidding façade that he spoke. "You will observe, Watson, when we are admitted, whether the fires in this house burn coal or wood. It is a small matter, but I have found that small matters have a way of enlarging themselves in the course of an investigation." I confess I could make nothing of this remark, but I had long since ceased to expect Holmes to explain himself before the proper season. We were received by a manservant of the old school, silent and correct, who conducted us to a library of considerable size, lined from floor to ceiling with volumes that bore, even at a glance, the uniform bindings of a man who purchased his books by the yard rather than by their contents. Sir Matthew Ashcombe rose to greet us with a composure that struck me, from the very first, as remarkable in a man whose legal fortunes had so lately suffered a blow. He was perhaps 60 years of age, spare and upright, with a face of considerable natural charm, the sort of countenance that photographs well upon charitable committees, and does. His hair was silver and carefully dressed, his hands soft and unmarked by labour, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the practised warmth of a man who has spent a lifetime persuading others of his own reasonableness. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you do me honour, though I confess I hardly expected Carstairs to summon so illustrious a consultant over what is, after all, a matter for the police rather than for private enterprise. The police, Sir Matthew, have already been informed, I believe." "They have, and a most civil inspector called upon me only this morning. Lestrade, I think his name was. I told him what I shall tell you, that the loss of the bill, while regrettable, is scarcely the catastrophe my solicitors seem to believe. You are not distressed, then, by its destruction? Sir Matthew spread his hands in a gesture of practised candour. Mr. Holmes, I will be perfectly open with you, for I have nothing to conceal. The bill, as it stood, contained arguments that were of considerable service to my claim. Its loss is inconvenient, but certified copies exist in the court's own records, and my case does not stand or fall upon a single sheet of parchment, however elegantly drawn. I own that this frankness surprised me, and I glanced at Holmes to see how he received it. His face, however, betrayed nothing beyond a mild and general interest, such as a naturalist might display before a beetle of no very uncommon species. You speak of the matter with great equanimity, Sir Matthew. What would you have me do, sir? Rage and tear my hair? I have found in a long life that equanimity accomplishes what passion cannot. It was at this moment that a lady entered the room, a widow, as her black gown proclaimed, though her mourning had evidently softened into the second stage of half-colours, a touch of grey at the collar. She was introduced as Mrs. Eleanor Ashcombe, the niece by marriage of whom Carstairs had spoken, and I observed at once a certain constraint in her manner that had been wholly absent from Sir Matthew's polished ease. She answered our questions civilly enough, and spoke of her uncle with a respect that seemed genuine so far as it went. But when Holmes, with apparent idleness, turned the conversation to the disputed estate itself, a shadow passed across her face, and her hands, which had lain quiet in her lap, closed themselves together with sudden tension. "My husband," she said, in answer to a question so gently put that I scarcely noticed its purpose, "believed until the day of his death that my uncle had used the family trust to deprive him of what was rightfully his. I do not say that I share that belief, Mr. Holmes. I say only that he held it very strongly, and it embittered his last years." Sir Matthew, who had listened to this with an indulgent smile, laid a hand lightly upon her shoulder. "My dear Eleanor was ever loyal to her husband's memory, Mr. Holmes, whatever the courts may ultimately decide. I bear her no ill will for it. We were presently joined by Mr. Felix Vane, the senior partner, a heavy grey-whiskered man of perhaps 55, whose manner toward his client was correct to the point of formality, though I fancied I detected beneath it a certain reserve, as of a man performing a duty he no longer relished. He confirmed, in answer to Holmes, that he had personally conducted the Ashcombe litigation for upward of 4 years, and that he regarded the destruction of the bill as a serious professional embarrassment, whatever its ultimate effect upon the case. "I have never in 30 years of practice known such a thing to occur in our strong-room," said he. "It reflects very ill upon the security of the firm, whatever else it may signify." Holmes questioned him closely upon the mechanism of the lock, the disposition of the keys, and the hours during which the strong-room stood open in the ordinary course of business, receiving answers that were precise, professional, and, so far as I could judge, entirely without evasion. It was as we were preparing to take our leave that Holmes turned back, as though the thought had but that moment occurred to him, and addressed Sir Matthew directly. "One further question, Sir Matthew, if you will forgive my curiosity. Do you habitually read your legal papers here in this library beside the fire?" Sir Matthew laughed outright, a full and easy laugh that seemed to fill the sombre room with an incongruous warmth. "Never, Mr. Holmes. I detest smoke and the smell it leaves upon paper. My man reads to me from a chair by the window, where the light is good and the air is clean. You will think me an eccentric old fellow, I dare say." Holmes bowed, said nothing further, and led the way to the door. But I, who had walked at his side through 100 such interviews, saw the flicker that passed across his deep-set eyes, swift and gone as quickly as it had come, and knew that some small stone had been dropped into the still pool of his mind, from which the ripples would not cease until they had reached the farthest shore. We did not speak again until our cab had turned into the Marylebone Road, and even then it was only to remark upon the thickening of the fog. Chapter 3. Fire in the Chancery Room. 2 days passed without further word from Lincoln's Inn, and I had begun to suppose that Holmes's interest in the affair, never more than provisionally engaged, had settled into that peculiar species of dormancy from which only some fresh stimulus could rouse it. I was mistaken. On the Thursday morning, while I was yet at my breakfast, the sound of a cab drawing up with unusual haste beneath our windows brought Holmes from his chair before I had so much as set down my cup. That is Carstairs again, Watson, and driving his cabman to a speed that will cost him a shilling in gratuity beyond the fare. Something has happened. He was proved right within the minute. Our visitor entered in a state of agitation far exceeding that of his first call, his hat still in his hand, his breath coming short from the stairs. Mr. Holmes, the bill, what remained of it, the certified duplicate portion held in our private document room, it has been burned. Burned to ash, sir, and this within a chamber locked overnight and opened only by myself this morning. Holmes was upon his feet in an instant, reaching for his coat. You say burned to ash, not merely damaged, but consumed? Almost entirely, sir. I found the remains not an hour since, and came directly to you, calling at Scotland Yard upon my way to acquaint Inspector Lestrade of the matter. We found that gentleman already arrived before us, when our cab drew up in Lincoln's Inn Fields, standing in the doorway of a small windowless chamber that served the firm as a repository for its most sensitive papers. Lestrade greeted Holmes with a mixture of respect and faint impatience that had grown habitual between them. "A queer business, mister." "Holmes? Though I fancy a plain enough one when you look past the queerness of it. No forced entry, the lock was not tampered with, and there is but the one key, which Mr. Carstairs here carries upon his own watch-chain. No window, as you see, for ventilation is by that grating alone, too small for a cat to pass. And yet here is your fire, plain as day." He gestured toward a small iron wastebasket that stood beside the clerk's writing table. Within it lay a quantity of blackened and curling fragments, still faintly acrid upon the air, and among them, less consumed than the rest, the corner of an envelope that bore, in a hand I already recognised from the index volumes at Baker Street, the name of Sir Matthew Ashcombe. The envelope was addressed to Sir Matthew. "So it would appear, sir. My theory is a simple one. Someone with access to this room, and there are but 3 such persons beyond the partners, removed the bill from its case, thrust it into the basket along with whatever correspondence came to hand, and set the whole alight. A moment's work, and the door locked again upon leaving. Your theory has the merit of simplicity, Lestrade, which is not always the same merit as truth." Holmes had knelt beside the wastebasket and was examining its contents with the aid of his pocket lens, his attention moving with unhurried thoroughness from one fragment to the next. "You will observe that the fire did not spread beyond the basket itself." "Well, and why should it? A wastebasket is an iron one, is it not?" "Iron, certainly, but the desk stands within 18 inches of it, and I see no scorching upon the wood, no discoloration of the varnish, no soot upon the wall behind. A fire set in anger, Lestrade, or in haste, or by a hand unpractised in such work, does not confine itself so neatly. It licks at what is near. It leaves its signature upon the surrounding surfaces even when the principal fuel is contained. This fire possessed manners." Lestrade permitted himself a short laugh. "Manners, Mr. Holmes? I never heard a fire credited with manners before." "Then you have had less occasion than I to study them. A fire is as individual as a signature, Lestrade, and quite as capable of betraying the hand that made it." He turned to Carstairs. "Who had access to this room beyond yourself?" "The same 3 persons I named to you before, Mr. Holmes. Mrs. Ashcombe, who has been assisting with certain family papers and was given a key some months since for that purpose. Mr. Vane, who as senior partner holds keys to every chamber in the building, and old Rudge, our Chancery clerk, whose duties bring him here daily." Lestrade had already begun, with the brisk confidence of a man who feels the ground firm beneath him, to sketch the shape of his inquiry, and within the hour he had interviewed all 3 and returned to us with an air of modest triumph. "Motive enough for any of the 3, Mr. Holmes, and more than enough for some. The widow's husband died believing himself cheated by Sir Matthew. That much you know already. Mr. Vane, it seems, has more than once been asked by his client to pursue strategies he privately considered sharp practice and chafes under it. And the clerk, Rudge. There is a son who lost a place in the city after publicly accusing Sir Matthew of some crooked dealing, though nothing was ever proved. Any one of the three might have struck this blow and struck it gladly. And yet each of the three, said Holmes, was elsewhere at the hour in question, or so I apprehend from your own inquiries. Elsewhere, or so they say, and so their households confirm. But an alibi is a thing that can be arranged, Mr. Holmes, as well as a fire. Holmes had returned to his examination of the fragments. Lifting one with a pair of small forceps he carried always about him for such purposes, and holding it to the light of the single gas jet that lit the windowless room. This paper, Lestrade, is thicker than the ordinary stock used for Chancery pleadings, and here, do you see this corner, where the ruling of the margin yet survives the flame? It is ruled in a fashion I do not associate with formal pleadings at all. Paper is paper, Mr. Holmes. I should not build too much upon the thickness of it. Perhaps not, but here is a circumstance upon which I think we may build a very great deal. Holmes had drawn from among the ashes, with the delicacy of a surgeon, a minute globule of red substance hardened and cracked by the heat. Sealing wax, Lestrade, and red at that. Mr. Carstairs, was the Chancery bill sealed with wax? Certainly not, Mr. Holmes. Chancery bills of this character are bound with green ribbon through punched eyelets. There has never been a wax seal upon any paper in this suit to my certain knowledge. A silence fell upon the little room, broken only by Lestrade's dissatisfied clearing of the throat. Some other paper, then, chanced to be in the basket along with the bill, said he, though with rather less conviction than before. A sealed letter thrown away by accident. Accidents, Lestrade, Holmes replied, rising and dusting the ash from his knees, have a curious habit, in my experience, of choosing precisely the moment that is most convenient for somebody. I confess that the abundance of motive in this case interests me a good deal less than the nature of what has actually been destroyed. We are, I think, further from the truth than any of us yet supposes. Chapter 4. 3 excellent motives. Lestrade was not a man to abandon a promising theory merely because Sherlock Holmes had expressed a doubt of it, and in the days that followed he pursued his 3 suspects with a thoroughness that did him credit, whatever I might think of the direction of his labours. He called upon us on the Saturday evening, settling himself before our fire with the air of a man who has walked a great distance and covered a great deal of ground, and proceeded to lay his findings before us with evident satisfaction. I have now had each of them under close questioning, Mr. Holmes, and I do not mind telling you that the case grows blacker for all 3 the more one examines it. Take the widow first. Mrs. Ashcombe admits, without my pressing her over much, that the Chancery proceedings very nearly ruined her husband before his death, that he sank into a melancholy from which he never fully recovered, believing himself cheated of an inheritance by Sir Matthew's manoeuvring. She does not deny that she has, upon occasion, wished the whole suit at the bottom of the Thames. A natural sentiment, Holmes observed, and one she was under no obligation to confess to you at all. Continue. Then there is Vane. I got more from him than I expected, for he is not a man who volunteers his feelings readily. He confessed, and I use the word advisedly, Mr. Holmes, for it cost him something to say it, that Sir Matthew had more than once instructed him to pursue a particular legal technicality in the suit, which Vane himself considered little better than sharp practice. He would not specify the technicality, citing his duty to his client, but he admitted the disagreement had grown serious enough that he had contemplated withdrawing from the case altogether, and did not withdraw. No, sir, he said, a solicitor does not abandon a client of 30 years' standing over a difference of conscience, however uncomfortable, which is honest enough, I suppose, though it leaves him with a very pretty motive for wishing some inconvenient piece of paper out of existence. Holmes had taken up his violin during this recital, though he did not play it, holding it instead across his knee and drawing the bow idly across a single string without pressing it to sound. And the clerk? Rudge was the hardest nut of the 3, Mr. Holmes, close as an oyster at first, until I put it to him plainly that his silence would serve his son no better than his son's public accusations had served him. He broke down a little then, and told me that his boy had held a respectable place with a firm of stockbrokers until he accused Sir Matthew, in a moment of indiscretion at some public dinner, of corrupt dealing in a matter unconnected with the present suit. Nothing was proved, you understand, but the accusation reached the boy's employers, and he was quietly given his notice within the month. Roger's never forgiven Sir Matthew for it, though he has served the firm that serves him faithfully enough. 3 motives, then, said Holmes, setting down the violin at last. Each of them genuine, each of them of long standing, and each of them, I think, known to the persons themselves rather better than they are known to one another. Have you established, Lestrade, where each of the 3 passed the hours in question? I have, and there is the difficulty. Mrs. Ashcombe was at her own lodgings in Chelsea the whole evening. Her maid will swear to it. Vane dined at his club, and was seen there by no fewer than 4 members. Rudge was at home with his wife, who confirms it, though I need hardly say a wife's word in such a matter carries less weight than a stranger's. An alibi confirmed by an interested party is not thereby worthless, Lestrade, though I grant it wants the corroboration of disinterested witness. You have, in short, 3 persons each possessed of ample reason to wish the bill destroyed, and each apparently elsewhere when the destruction occurred. Which is precisely why I say, Mr. Holmes, that one of the 3 alibis must be false, and the sooner we determine which, the sooner this case is closed. Holmes rose and crossed to the window, where the gaslight from the street below cast his sharp profile in silhouette against the curtain. You reason, Lestrade, as though the destruction of the bill were the whole of the crime, and the identity of its destroyer the whole of the mystery. I confess I am no longer persuaded that this is so. What else should it be, if not that? I do not yet know, but consider with me a moment. We have established, I think beyond serious dispute, that this was no fire of passion. It was contained, deliberate, and left no mark beyond its own small compass. We have established further that among the ashes lay fragments of paper thicker than the ordinary Chancery stock, ruled in a fashion inconsistent with formal pleading, and a globule of red sealing wax where Mr. Carstairs assures us no wax seal ever touched the genuine bill. These are not the details of a crime committed in a fit of righteous anger by a wronged niece, an uneasy solicitor, or a bitter old clerk. They are the details of a crime planned with considerable care and executed with a coolness that sits ill beside the passionate motives you have so carefully assembled. Lestrade frowned, turning his hat about in his hands. You think the motive and the method do not match, then? I think, Lestrade, that a man consumed by 30 years of grievance does not pause, in the moment of his revenge, to consider the ruling of his margins. Passion is a poor bookkeeper. It does not preserve its accounts so tidily. Holmes turned from the window, and I saw in his face that expression of quiet, gathering intensity which I had learned, over the years of our association, to recognise as the surest sign that some new thread had presented itself to his eye, though its pattern was not yet plain even to himself. No, I begin to suspect that the abundance of motive in this case is not a fortunate accident for the investigator, but a circumstance as carefully arranged as the fire itself. Someone has taken pains, Lestrade, to ensure that when we looked for a guilty party, we should find not 1, but 3, each so plausible that suspicion must divide itself into uselessness among them. And if that is so, Mr. Holmes, who has arranged it? That, my dear Inspector, is precisely what I intend to discover, but I shall not discover it by asking any of your 3 suspects whether they burned the bill. I shall discover it, I think, by asking them a great many questions that appear to have nothing to do with fire at all. Chapter 5. Questions without accusations. Holmes was true to his word, and in the days that followed I observed him conduct what I can only describe as a campaign of oblique inquiry, in which the word fire was scarcely mentioned, and the burned bill itself might have been forgotten entirely. So little did it figure in his conversation with the three persons under suspicion. We called first upon Mrs. Ashcombe at her lodgings in Chelsea, a modest but tasteful set of rooms overlooking the river, where she received us with the same quiet reserve I had noted at Ashcombe House. Holmes made no reference whatever to the fire, but instead drew her, with a gentleness I had not always known him to employ, into speech of her late husband. He was a barrister, I believe, before his health failed him. He was Mr. Holmes, and a promising one, until the suit consumed the greater part of his energies, and I think his hope. She looked toward the window, where the grey light of the river fell upon her face. He came to believe, in his last year, that my uncle had concealed some document, he never told me precisely what, which would have proved that a portion of the estate, the Bloomsbury houses in particular, belonged rightfully to another branch of the family entirely. He spoke of it toward the end almost as a man possessed. I confess I did not always credit it. Grief takes strange shapes, Mr. Holmes, and I thought his conviction only one of them. You think differently now? She hesitated, and her hands, which had lain still in her lap, moved to smooth a fold of her gown that required no smoothing. I do not know what I think now, only that since the bill was burned, I found myself wondering whether he was right after all, and whether someone else has come, at last, to share his belief. Holmes thanked her with a courtesy that concealed, I think, a considerable satisfaction, and we took our leave without his having once asked her the question that Lestrade would certainly have put within the first minute of the interview. From Chelsea we proceeded to Lincoln's Inn, where Mr. Vane received us in his private chamber, a room lined with deed boxes bearing the names of clients living and dead, each labelled in a hand grown steadily less firm, I fancied, as the years advanced. Holmes's questions here took a different turn. You have practised in Chancery a long while, Mr. Vane. Tell me, is it a common thing for a solicitor to substitute a copy for an original document in the course of litigation? Not with fraudulent intent, you understand, but for the ordinary purposes of the office. A working copy, perhaps, kept in circulation while the original is preserved elsewhere. Vane's heavy face grew thoughtful, and he answered with the deliberation of a man choosing his words with some care. Authenticated copies are in constant use, Mr. Holmes, and no impropriety attaches to their employment, provided the original is not thereby suppressed or altered in its legal effect. But a deliberate substitution, one copy passed off for another with intent to deceive the court, or one's own client, as to which document truly governs the matter, that would be a very serious thing indeed. It would be, in plain terms, professional ruin for the solicitor who attempted it, and worse if it were ever proved. You speak with some feeling upon the subject. I speak as any honest practitioner must, Mr. Holmes. I have given 30 years to this profession, and I should not care to see its name dishonoured by such a trick, whatever the provocation. I thought I detected beneath the generality of this answer something more particular struggling for expression, but Holmes did not press him further, and we withdrew with nothing more definite than Vane's evident and, I believed, genuine discomfort upon the subject of substituted documents. It was upon Thomas Rudge that Holmes spent the longest interview of the three, and it was conducted at Holmes's own insistence, not at the offices in Lincoln's Inn, but at the old clerk's modest home in Camberwell, a narrow house of blackened brick where Rudge lived alone but for a housekeeper who came in by the day. The old man received us with a stiff and careful courtesy, seating us in a small parlour crowded with the accumulated furniture of a long and frugal life, and answered Holmes's opening questions as to his years of service, his duties, his knowledge of the strong-room's arrangements, with the plain, unadorned precision of a man long accustomed to giving evidence. Then Holmes asked him a question that I confess startled me by its abruptness. Mr. Rudge, do you believe that a man is always bound to obey the law, even where the law itself protects a wrong? Rudge was silent a long moment, his weathered hands folded upon his knee, entirely still. When he answered, it was with the caution of a man who has considered the question before, and privately. A clerk is not appointed to decide what justice means, Mr. Holmes. I have spent 30 years copying out other men's decisions, not making my own. It is not for me to say when the law is wrong, only to see that it is followed correctly. That is a lawyer's answer, Mr. Rudge, not a man's. Perhaps, sir, I have kept lawyers' company a long while. It leaves its mark, as any trade will." Holmes turned then to the matter of Sir Matthew's treatment of the clerk's son, and here I observed a change come over Rudge that his composure upon the subject of the fire had entirely concealed. His hands, so steady through all the earlier questioning, began to tremble upon his knee, and a flush rose beneath the grey stubble of his cheek. "My boy did nothing but speak the truth as he believed it, Mr. Holmes, at a dinner where better men than he have said worse and suffered nothing for it. But Sir Matthew is a gentleman of influence, and my son a clerk's son with no influence at all, and within the month he had lost his place, and has not found another to match it since. I do not forgive that, sir, and I will not pretend to you that I do." "And yet your hands did not tremble when we spoke of the burning of the bill, Mr. Rudge. Only now, when we speak of your son." The old clerk looked up sharply, and for an instant something moved behind his eyes that might have been fear, or might have been only the pain of an old wound freshly touched. He said nothing further upon the subject, and Holmes, with a courtesy that surprised me in a man so often accused of coldness, turned the conversation to other matters and shortly afterward took his leave. "You are convinced it was Rudge," I said, as we walked toward the omnibus in the gathering dusk. "His grievance is the plainest of the three, and his agitation just now was unmistakable. Strong feeling, Watson, is not evidence of action. A man may tremble at the mention of a wrong done to his son, and yet be entirely innocent of burning a Chancery bill. Indeed, I begin to suspect that it is precisely the plainness of Rudge's grievance which someone has been at pains to make use of." He drew his coat more closely about him against the evening chill. "We have 3 motives now laid bare before us, each genuine, each moving in its way. But motive, my dear fellow, is the commonest currency in the world. It is the counterfeiter's trade to make his coin resemble the true one, and I begin to wonder whether we are looking, in this case, at counterfeit motive dressed most carefully in the clothing of the true." Chapter 6. The Weight of Conscience. I did not see Holmes for the better part of 2 days following our visit to Camberwell, for he had fallen into one of those periods of restless solitary activity during which he was accustomed to vanish from our rooms at odd hours and return at others, offering no account of his movements beyond the occasional cryptic remark dropped over a hurried breakfast. I gathered from the state of his boots, and from a certain smell of dust and old paper that clung persistently to his coat, that his inquiries had carried him back more than once to the offices in Lincoln's Inn Fields, though upon what particular errand I could not at first determine. It was upon the 3rd morning that he returned in unusually good spirits, flung himself into his armchair, and began at once to fill his pipe with the black shag he affected, when a problem was, as he put it, ripening rather than merely fermenting. "I have spent 2 most instructive days, Watson, in the company of wastepaper baskets, correspondence registers, and the domestic habits of Bellamy, Harcourt, and Vane. It is remarkable what a firm's rubbish will tell you, if only you trouble to sort it properly. You have been going through their refuse, with the cheerful cooperation of a junior clerk who supposed me to be conducting an insurance inquiry, and who was only too pleased to earn half a crown for his trouble. I have learned, among other things, who lights the fires in that establishment, who locks the cupboards of an evening, who sorts the outgoing post, and, this is the interesting part, Watson, who habitually prepares the bundles of superseded drafts for destruction. And who does? Young Carstairs himself, as it happens. It is a junior's duty in most such firms, and he performs it, by all accounts, with conscientious regularity, sending for burning each week whatever drafts have been superseded by fair copies or abandoned in the course of drafting. A perfectly innocent office habit, Watson, and one that any solicitor's clerk in London might tell you of without a blush. And yet it interests me a very great deal for reasons I am not yet prepared to state." He would say no more upon the head, but proceeded to a second discovery which he seemed to regard as of scarcely less importance. I learned also from the same obliging clerk that Mr. Felix Vane recently ordered a search made through the firm's older files upon the Ashcombe matter, papers going back a dozen years and more, long predecessors to the present suit. This was some 3 weeks before the bill was burned, Watson. I confess I should like to know what he was looking for. We had not long to wait upon that question, for Holmes called at Vane's chambers that same afternoon and put the matter to him directly, without any of the circumlocution he had employed in our earlier interview. The solicitor's heavy face grew grave, and after a long pause, in which he seemed to weigh some private struggle to its conclusion, he spoke with the manner of a man laying down a burden he had carried too long alone. "I will tell you, Mr. Holmes, since you have evidently already discovered that there is something to tell. I found, among the older correspondence, a memorandum in old Josiah Ashcombe's own hand, dated some years before his death, which I have every reason to believe Sir Matthew has long known of, and has taken very particular care should never come before the court. It touches upon his brother's true intentions regarding the Bloomsbury property, and if genuine, and I have no reason to doubt it, it would very materially weaken, perhaps destroy altogether, my client's claim to the estate as presently constituted. You confronted Sir Matthew with this discovery?" "I did, Mr. Holmes, privately, some fortnight since. I asked him plainly whether the memorandum ought not to be disclosed, as I believe our professional duty required. He refused. He told me in terms I shall not forget that a solicitor's duty was to his client's interest, and not to his own scruples, and that I might resign the case if my conscience would not permit me to continue it upon those terms." "And did you resign?" Vane's hands, resting upon the desk before him, closed slowly into fists, though his voice remained level. "I did not, Mr. Holmes. I told myself that another solicitor, less troubled by conscience, would take up the case within the week, and that Sir Matthew's advantage would only be strengthened by my departure, since a new man would come to the matter ignorant of the memorandum's existence. I persuaded myself that I could serve justice better by remaining than by leaving in a fit of righteous indignation. I do not know even now whether I was right." He looked up at Holmes with an expression I found genuinely moving in so reserved a man. "But I give you my word, sir, whatever you may think of my conduct in the matter, that I did not burn the bill. I would not destroy evidence, however troubling to my client. I would sooner have laid the memorandum before the court myself, and taken the professional consequences." Holmes regarded him a long moment, and I saw in his face that particular stillness which, in him, signified belief rather than doubt. "I think I credit you, Mr. Vane. But tell me, who else knew of this memorandum's discovery, beyond yourself and Sir Matthew?" "No one, Mr. Holmes, so far as I'm aware, unless Sir Matthew spoke of it to someone in his own household, which I could not answer for." It was later that same evening, in a further conversation with Mrs. Ashcombe, that a fresh thread presented itself. She confessed to Holmes with evident reluctance that she had some weeks earlier begged old Rudge to search the firm's archives for any paper touching upon her husband's old grievance. The concealed evidence he had believed in his last illness would vindicate his claim against Sir Matthew. "I did not know, Mr. Holmes, that Mr. Vane had already made a similar search, or found what he found. I asked Rudge only because he had access to the older files, and I did not like to trouble Mr. Vane himself with what seemed, at the time, an old widow's fancy rather than a serious inquiry." Holmes said little upon leaving her, but I could see that his mind was working with the swift, silent intensity that I had learned to recognise as the surest sign of real progress, however little he chose to share of it with me. "You perceive, Watson," said he, as our cab rattled homeward through streets now thick with evening fog, "how the threads of this affair have begun to interweave themselves. Vane discovers a suppressed memorandum and is torn between conscience and duty. Eleanor Ashcombe, all unknowing of Vane's discovery, sets Rudge upon a parallel search for the very same evidence. Rudge, loyal to the firm yet bound by sympathy to the widow's cause, finds himself standing at the crossing of two currents, neither of which he himself set flowing. Each of these three persons has excellent reason to wish Sir Matthew's claim exposed. Each also has excellent reason to protect another. Vane to protect his professional honour, Eleanor to protect the memory of her husband, Rudge, I begin to suspect, to protect someone nearer to him than either. You think the fire was set to shield one of them from the other's suspicion? I think, Watson, that the crime was designed not merely to destroy a piece of paper, but to arrange matters so that three innocent people should each appear, to any investigator, however acute, equally capable of having destroyed it. It is a most elegant piece of misdirection, and elegance of that particular kind is not, in my experience, the natural product of an old man's grievance or a widow's grief. It is the work of a mind trained to construct arguments. A legal mind, Watson, and a very careful one. Chapter 7. The Clerk's Confession. It was upon a Tuesday, some 10 days after our first interview with Carstairs, that the affair appeared to resolve itself with a suddenness which took even Holmes, I think, by surprise, though he concealed the fact better than I did my own astonishment. We had scarcely finished our breakfast when a note arrived from Lestrade, brief and triumphant in its tone, requesting our immediate attendance at Scotland Yard. Holmes read it twice, his brow contracting into the small characteristic frown he wore when a development ran contrary to some private calculation of his own, and then rose without a word and reached for his hat. We found the inspector in a state of scarcely contained satisfaction, seated behind his desk with the air of a man who has brought a troublesome matter to a swift and creditable conclusion. "It is over, Mr. Holmes, or very nearly so. Rudge came to me himself not 2 hours since, and made a clean breast of the whole affair. He confesses to burning the Chancery bill with his own hand." I confess my first sensation was one of vindication, for I had suspected the old clerk from the very first, and I said as much to Holmes as we followed Lestrade down the corridor to the room where Rudge waited under a constable's eye. Holmes made no reply beyond a slight compression of the lips that I ought, perhaps, to have read as a warning against premature satisfaction. Rudge sat very upright upon a hard chair, his hands folded before him with a composure that seemed, to my eye, the calm of a man who has at last set down a weight too long carried alone. He looked up as we entered, and there was in his weathered face neither defiance nor fear, but only a kind of tired resolution. "I have told the inspector the truth, gentlemen, and I do not mean to unsay any part of it now. I burned the bill. I could not go on, after 30 years' service, watching Sir Matthew grind good people beneath him and calling it law. My son was only the last of it, though he weighed most heavily on my mind. I took the old duplicate key I've carried these many years, one Mr. Bellamy himself gave me when I first came to the firm, before the locks were changed, and I let myself into the document room after the clerks had gone, and I put the bill in the basket and I burned it, and I do not repent of it, whatever the law may say to me now." He produced, as if in confirmation, a small brass key, worn smooth with age, which he laid upon the table before Lestrade with the deliberate gesture of a man surrendering the last of his defences. Lestrade regarded the key and the confession with evident satisfaction. "There, Mr. Holmes, a key that fits the lock, a motive as plain as daylight, and a confession freely given without threat or inducement of any kind. I do not see what more the case requires." Vane, who had been sent for and arrived shortly after ourselves, listened to the old clerk's statement with visible distress, and when it was concluded he spoke up with a warmth that surprised me in so reserved a man. "Inspector, I must beg you to consider the circumstances before you press this matter to its fullest severity. Rudge has served the firm faithfully for 30 years. Whatever he has done under a provocation that few men could have borne so long without breaking. I will myself speak on his behalf, if the matter comes before a court." Eleanor Ashcombe, when she heard of the confession that same afternoon, would say nothing in condemnation of the old clerk, and I thought I detected in her silence something very like relief. Relief, perhaps, that the burden of guilt had settled at last upon shoulders other than her own, or upon those of someone she had feared might be closer to the truth than Rudge himself. I own that I too found the confession entirely satisfactory. It fitted every fact we had gathered: the key, the motive, the opportunity, the man's own evident and long-suppressed bitterness, and I said as much to Holmes as we walked together from the yard. "It explains a great deal, Watson, I grant you, It does not, however, explain the ruling upon the margin of the fragments, nor the sealing wax where no seal should have been, nor the curious fact that this fire, alone among all the fires I have studied, left not the smallest trace beyond its own iron basket. But let us not be hasty. I should like to put one further question to Mr. Rudge before I commit myself to any conclusion. We returned, therefore, to the room where the old clerk sat, and Holmes addressed him with a courtesy that seemed, even to my sympathetic eye, almost gentle beside the bluntness of Lestrade's earlier questioning. "Mr. Rudge, I have one question only, and I ask it not to trap you, but because a small point of method interests me, as such points always will. When you set the bill alight in the basket, the papers being folded I collect in their usual form with the outer cover uppermost, which end of the document caught the flame first? The bound edge, where the ribbon passed through the eyelets, or the loose edge of the leaves?" Rudge's composure, so steady through all that had gone before, wavered for the first time. He looked down at his folded hands, and a long moment passed before he answered, his voice lower than it had been. I could not say, Mr. Holmes. It happened quickly, and I did not stay to watch it burn, but left directly the flame had caught, for fear of being discovered." "You did not stay to see it consumed, and yet you were confident enough in your statement to the inspector that the whole bill was destroyed." "I assumed it, sir. I do not see what else I could have assumed, having set the fire myself." Holmes bowed his head slightly, as though the answer satisfied him, and pressed the matter no further. He thanked Rudge for his patience, exchanged a few words with Lestrade regarding the formalities of the charge, and led me out into the grey afternoon without another word upon the subject, until we had gone some distance along the embankment. You will have observed, Watson, that a man does not usually forget the manner of a thing he has done with his own hands and at considerable personal risk. Such details burn themselves, if you will forgive the expression, into the memory far more thoroughly than into the paper. Rudge's hesitation interested me a great deal more than his confession. "You think he is lying, then? Protecting someone?" "I think it does not greatly matter, for our present purposes, what I believe Rudge to be doing, so much as what the evidence itself will bear out. His hesitation is not proof of innocence, Watson, any more than his trembling hands in Camberwell were proof of guilt. But it is a fact, and facts, however small, have a way of accumulating into certainty if one has but the patience to gather enough of them." He drew his coat collar higher against the wind coming off the river, and I saw upon his face that expression of fixed, quiet purpose, which told me, more surely than any words, that the case was very far from closed. We shall return to the ashes themselves, I think, before I trouble myself further with confessions. Paper, unlike men, Watson, does not know how to lie. Chapter 8. The Unburned Eyelet. Holmes obtained, through some representation to Lestrade which I did not entirely follow, but which the inspector, still flushed with the satisfaction of his confession, was pleased to grant without demur, leave to make one further examination of the burned fragments before they were consigned to whatever official repository awaited them as evidence. We returned, therefore, to the small windowless chamber in Lincoln's Inn Fields upon the following morning, Holmes carrying with him a leather case of instruments that I had seen him employ upon 100 occasions, though never, I think, with quite the same quality of concentrated purpose that marked him now. He spread a sheet of clean white paper upon the clerk's table, and upon it, with the forceps and the delicacy of a surgeon at some particularly intricate operation, began to lay out the contents of the iron basket, fragment by blackened fragment, arranging them not according to size or apparent importance, but according to some system of his own that I could not at first perceive. For the better part of an hour he worked in silence, save for the occasional murmured word to himself, while I sat by the window and watched the fog press itself against the small square of grating that served the room for air. It was not until he had very nearly exhausted the contents of the basket that a sudden stillness came over him, and I saw him bend low over the table, his lens pressed close to some object no larger, so far as I could judge from across the room, than a grain of wheat. "Watson, come here, if you please, and tell me what you make of this." I crossed to his side and looked where he directed, and saw, resting upon the tip of his forceps, a tiny disc of tarnished brass, no larger than a shirt button, pierced through its centre and blackened upon one face by the fire, though the metal itself had not melted. "An eyelet of some kind," said I. "A fastening, surely, from a garment or a book." "From neither, Watson, but from a bundle of papers. You will recall that Mr. Carstairs was most particular, at our very first interview, in describing the manner in which the Chancery bill was bound, stitched, through punched holes with green ribbon, in the ordinary fashion of such formal pleadings. He was equally particular, when I questioned him again but yesterday, that no brass fastening of any kind was ever employed upon that document, from its first drafting to its final presentation before the court. Then this eyelet belongs to some other paper entirely. Precisely so, and I have spent the better part of this morning, before you rose, Watson, in the company of Mr. Carstairs in the firm's own file room, examining a very great number of documents of various kinds, in order to discover what class of paper is customarily secured with just such a fastening as this. He held the small brass disc up to the light, turning it slowly between the points of his forceps. "I find, Watson, that it is the invariable practice of this firm, and I am told of most others in Lincoln's Inn, to secure preliminary office copies, working drafts not yet perfected for formal filing, with precisely this species of eyelet, for the very good reason that such drafts are frequently unbound and rebound as corrections are made, a process ill-suited to ribbon, and far better, served by a fastening that may be removed and replaced at will." I felt the ground shift beneath the case as he spoke, though I could not yet see the whole of the structure that was rising from it. "You mean to say that what was burned in this basket was not the Chancery bill at all?" "I mean to say precisely that, Watson. What Mr. Rudge confessed to burning, and what was in fact reduced to ash before us, was not the formal pleading upon which Sir Matthew's claim depends, but a bundle, or several bundles, of superseded office drafts, the very sort of paper that Mr. Carstairs himself is accustomed to send for destruction in the ordinary course of his weekly duties. The thickness of the paper that troubled me from the first, the ruling of the margin so unlike formal pleading, the fragments of shorthand annotation I have this morning found, upon 2 further pieces I have not yet shown you, all point to the same conclusion. These were working papers, Watson, not the bill itself. But then Rudge's confession is false, Watson, though I do not think it is a lie told for his own benefit. A man does not confess to a crime he did not commit without some very powerful reason, and the plainest such reason I can conceive is that he believes himself to be shielding someone else, someone whose guilt he has discovered or guessed at, and whose exposure he cannot bear to compass, even at the cost of his own liberty. I own that I sat down rather heavily upon the clerk's own stool at this, for the case had turned itself entirely about beneath me, and I required a moment to set my thoughts once more in order. Then where is the true bill if it was never burned at all? That, Watson, is the question to which everything now points. If the document in this basket was a substitute, prepared and burned in order that we should believe the genuine bill destroyed, then someone has taken very particular care to remove the genuine bill from harm's way, while creating every outward appearance of its destruction. Consider what such a stratagem accomplishes. It halts the proceedings, or at the least throws them into confusion, precisely as a genuine destruction would. It sets 3 innocent people beneath the shadow of suspicion, each with motive enough to satisfy even so thorough an officer as Lestrade. And yet it preserves, somewhere safe from Sir Matthew's reach, whatever the true bill may yet be made to prove, should the right moment for its production ever arrive. But who would go to such lengths, Holmes, and to what end? To what end, I think I begin to perceive. though I am not yet prepared to name the hand that has moved these pieces about the board. As to who, I would remind you, Watson, of one fact that has sat quietly at the edge of this case since its very beginning, unremarked because it seemed too small to signify. It is Mr. Edmund Carstairs, and no other, who prepares the bundles of superseded drafts for burning in the ordinary course of the firm's business. It is Carstairs who possesses, by virtue of his office, ready and unremarkable access to precisely the class of document whose ashes now lie before us. And it was Carstairs, Watson, who came to us at the very first, and Carstairs again who summoned us upon the morning of the second fire, in each case before any other person had thought to raise the alarm. He gathered the fragments before him with sudden care, wrapping them in a fold of tissue paper as tenderly as a jeweller handling uncut stones. I do not say the matter is proved, Watson, but I begin to think we have been looking throughout this whole affair in precisely the direction that someone of considerable cleverness intended we should look, and that the true story lies not among the three persons Lestrade has so diligently examined, but in the quiet, careful hands of the one person who has, from the very first hour of this case, appeared to us only as a messenger, and never once as a suspect. Chapter 9. Holmes names the burner. Holmes requested through Lestrade that all the principal parties to the affair should assemble upon the following afternoon in the largest of the conference rooms at Bellamy, Harcourt and Vane, and I could see, from the particular care with which he dressed that morning, and the unusual reticence with which he met my own inquiries over breakfast, that he anticipated the interview would be no ordinary one. We found them gathered when we arrived. Sir Matthew Ashcombe, composed as ever in a chair near the fire, his silver head inclined with an air of patient forbearance, as though he attended some tedious formality that concerned him only remotely. Eleanor Ashcombe, seated a little apart, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Felix Vane, standing rather than sitting, his heavy face grave. Thomas Rudge, brought from custody under escort, his eyes fixed upon the floor. And young Carstairs, who rose to greet us with a punctilious civility that struck me, in the light of what Holmes had told me the day before, as considerably more brittle than it had appeared at our first meeting. Lestrade completed the company, standing near the door with the air of a man reserving judgment until he had heard the whole. Holmes did not seat himself, but stood before the cold hearth, and addressed the room with the quiet, deliberate authority I had seen him assume upon a score of similar occasions. I have asked you here, gentlemen, and you, madam, because the matter of the burned Chancery bill has now been resolved to my own satisfaction, though the resolution will, I think, surprise more than one person in this room. Let me begin by stating what did not happen. The Chancery bill was not destroyed by Mrs. Ashcombe, whose grief for her husband, however genuine, found no outlet in this direction. It was not destroyed by Mr. Vane, whose troubled conscience led him to a private confrontation with his client, but never to an act of destruction. And it was not destroyed, whatever he himself may have told the inspector, by Mr. Rudge. Rudge's head came up sharply at this, and I saw something very like fear cross his weathered face. Mr. Rudge's confession, Holmes continued, was a falsehood, though I believe a generous one, offered to shield a man he had come to regard, I think, with something of a father's anxious affection. He discovered, in the course of his long service, evidence of what had truly been done, and rather than expose it, chose to take the burden upon his own shoulders. Whom, then, do you accuse, Mr. Holmes? This from Sir Matthew, whose composure had not altered by so much as a flicker throughout the recital. I come to that directly. The true history of this affair begins, Sir Matthew, some weeks before the first fire, when Mr. Vane, in the course of a search through your firm's older correspondence, discovered a memorandum in your late brother's own hand, a memorandum which, if produced before the court, would gravely weaken, perhaps destroy altogether, your claim to the Bloomsbury properties. Mr. Vane confronted you with this discovery. You instructed him to suppress it, and threatened, when he demurred, that his scruples might cost him his position as your solicitor. Sir Matthew's smile did not waver, though something colder moved behind his eyes. A private conversation between a client and his solicitor, Mr. Holmes, is not commonly regarded as evidence of anything at all. No more it is, standing alone. But it was overheard, Sir Matthew, or at the least its substance came to be known, by a junior member of the firm who had access to Mr. Vane's papers in the ordinary course of his duties. A young man who had, over some months of close attention to this case, come to believe that your claim rested not upon the just interpretation of your brother's will, but upon the deliberate concealment of his true intentions. Holmes turned now toward Carstairs, whose face had grown very pale, though he had not yet spoken. It was Mr. Carstairs, gentlemen, who conceived and executed the scheme which has occupied our attention these past 3 weeks. Carstairs opened his mouth as if to protest, but Holmes continued before he could speak, his voice carrying now the particular precision he reserved for the final unfolding of a case. As junior solicitor, Mr. Carstairs handled the drafting, copying and safekeeping of the Chancery Bill throughout its preparation. He also handled, as a matter of weekly routine, the destruction of superseded office drafts, bundles of working papers, secured not with the ribbon and eyelets of formal pleading, but with the ordinary brass fastenings employed for such preliminary documents. It was a simple matter for a man in his position to remove the genuine bill from its case in the strong room, secrete it in a place of safety, and substitute in its stead a bundle of obsolete drafts, folded and arranged to resemble, to a casual eye, the very document it replaced. This substitute he then burned in the wastebasket beside the clerk's desk, taking care that the fire should be contained and controlled, for he had no wish to draw more attention to the flames than the fact of destruction itself required. "This is monstrous, Mr. Holmes," Carstairs began, but his voice, which had carried such earnest distress at our first meeting, now trembled with a different quality altogether. "The fragments of that fire, Mr. Carstairs, bear shorthand annotations in a hand I have had the leisure to compare with correspondence you yourself have written in this firm's own letter-book. They bear also the mark of a brass eyelet such as no Chancery bill in this office has ever employed, and paper of a thickness inconsistent with formal pleading throughout. Old Rudge, I believe, discovered what you had done. Perhaps he came upon you in the strong-room, or found some trace of the substitution in the course of his own duties, and rather than see a young man he had watched grow up in the profession ruined and imprisoned, he took your guilt upon himself." Rudge's composure broke at last, and he buried his face in his hands, though he said nothing to contradict what Holmes had spoken. Carstairs stood very still for a long moment, and when he spoke again it was in a voice stripped of all its earlier formality, quiet and almost relieved, as a man speaks who has set down at last a weight too long carried in secret. "I did it, Mr. Holmes, and I will not pretend otherwise before you, but I ask you to understand why. I discovered the concealed memorandum myself, quite by accident, some weeks before Mr. Vane's own search revealed it to him. I saw plainly that Sir Matthew's claim, as it stood, depended upon a deception that the law itself, moving at its ordinary pace, might never uncover in time to prevent a grave injustice being done to Mrs. Ashcombe and her husband's memory. I could not simply expose it, for the memorandum alone, unsupported, might have been dismissed or explained away by counsel far more skilled than I. I judged that if the bill appeared destroyed, the proceedings must be delayed, and in that delay, I believed, the truth of the memorandum would surely come to official light through channels I dared not compromise by premature disclosure. You wished, in short, to correct a wrong by means of a deception of your own devising. I wished to prevent a greater wrong, Mr. Holmes, by a lesser one. I do not know that I was mistaken in the end I sought, whatever you may think of the means." Holmes regarded him with an expression I had rarely seen upon his face, not without sympathy, and yet entirely without softness. "You wish to correct dishonesty, Mr. Carstairs. Unfortunately, you chose deception as your instrument. Justice cannot safely depend upon each man secretly rewriting the rules when his own conscience troubles him, However genuine that trouble may be, where is the genuine bill now? In a deed box at my own lodgings, Mr. Holmes, locked, and the memorandum with it. I had intended, when the moment seemed right, to produce both together, as though they had been discovered rather than concealed. Within the hour a constable had been dispatched under Lestrade's direction to Carstairs' rooms, and returned before evening with the deed box itself, its lock unbroken, its contents entire. The genuine Chancery bill, and with it old Josiah Ashcombe's suppressed memorandum, lay once more upon the table where the case had first been laid before us, and Sir Matthew Ashcombe, I observed, had grown very pale indeed, his composure at last deserting him, as the true extent of his exposure became plain to every person in the room. Chapter 10. Law and Mercy. The weeks that followed the recovery of the genuine bill brought a resolution to the Ashcombe affair rather more complicated and rather more human than any of us had anticipated upon that grave afternoon in Lincoln's Inn Fields. Edmund Carstairs was, as the law required, charged with the removal and falsification of legal documents belonging to his employers, a matter which might in the ordinary course have ended in a term of imprisonment and the permanent ruin of a promising career. But the circumstances of the case, once laid before those responsible for determining his fate, proved a good deal more complicated than a simple tale of theft. Sir Matthew Ashcombe, now exposed before the whole legal world of Lincoln's Inn as a man who had knowingly suppressed evidence material to his own claim, found himself with little appetite for a sensational public trial that must inevitably drag his own conduct into the fiercest light of scrutiny. He withdrew, through his own counsel, from pressing the matter to its fullest severity, and the charge against Carstairs was in the end permitted to lapse upon conditions that spared him the worst consequences of his act, though not, I think, its lasting shadow upon his prospects. Felix Vane, whatever private sympathy he retained for the young man's motives, felt himself bound in professional duty to dismiss Carstairs from the firm, a decision he communicated, Holmes told me, with evident personal distress, and softened so far as his conscience permitted by speaking privately on the young solicitor's behalf to 2 or 3 other practitioners of his acquaintance, men who might in time be persuaded to overlook an error committed, as Vane himself put it, in the service of a truth too long concealed. Rudge's false confession earned him a stern reprimand from Lestrade, and a rather longer lecture from Holmes upon the dangers of taking the law into one's own hands, however loving the impulse that prompts it. But no serious charge was brought against the old clerk, the inspector having concluded, not without a certain gruff good humour, that a false confession offered in defence of another was a crime the law was ill-equipped and perhaps disinclined to punish with any severity. Eleanor Ashcombe, for her part, found in the recovered memorandum the vindication her husband had sought in vain throughout his final illness. The suppressed document, once laid before the court, materially altered the balance of the Chancery suit, and though the litigation itself would grind on, as such suits invariably do, for some further months before its formal conclusion, she came to us at Baker Street some weeks later to tell Holmes, with an emotion she made no effort to conceal, that her branch of the family had at last received assurance of a settlement that would restore to them what her husband had believed, until his dying day, had been wrongfully withheld. As for Sir Matthew himself, he escaped the criminal consequences that a less cautious man might have invited, for no law had been broken by his silence regarding a memorandum he was under no absolute obligation to disclose until the proper stage of proceeding. But the carefully constructed edifice of public respectability, which he had spent a lifetime erecting, did not survive the affair intact. The story of the memorandum and of a solicitor's clerk driven to extraordinary lengths by what he believed to be a grave injustice, found its way, in guarded and lawyerly language, into the columns that reported upon Chancery matters, and I do not think Sir Matthew Ashcombe sat again upon any charitable committee in London without observing, in the eyes of his fellow subscribers, a scrutiny that had not been there before. It was some weeks after the whole matter had reached its conclusion that Holmes and I sat once more beside our own fire at Baker Street. The November fog long since given way to the harder, cleaner cold of December, and I found myself turning the case over in my mind as I had turned over so many others in the quiet hours following their resolution. "I confess, Holmes," said I, "that I still feel a certain sympathy for young Carstairs, misguided as his conduct undoubtedly was. He acted, after all, in the service of a genuine wrong. I feel it also, Watson, and I will not pretend otherwise. It is no small thing for a young man to look upon dishonesty entrenched behind wealth and respectability, and to burn, as it were, with the desire to see it exposed. I have felt something of that fire myself, upon more than one occasion in our long association." He drew upon his pipe a moment before continuing. "But sympathy, my dear fellow, is a dangerous counsellor when it comes to weighing the means a man employs against the end he pursues. Carstairs convinced himself that his own certainty of Sir Matthew's guilt entitled him to deceive not only his employers and the court, but his own colleagues. To let an old man take a false confession upon himself, to let 3 innocent people labour for weeks beneath the shadow of suspicion, all so that his own private judgment of the case might prevail. That is a very great deal of harm to inflict in the service of a truth that might, given time and patience, have come to light by more honest means. You believe it would have come to light regardless?" "I believe, Watson, that Mr. Vane's own conscience would not have permitted the memorandum's permanent suppression, whatever difficulty its disclosure might have cost him professionally. Carstairs did not create the truth that ultimately triumphed in this case. He merely seized it into his own hands, out of impatience, and in doing so nearly destroyed a good deal of trust that honester methods would have left intact." I sat a while in silence, watching the fire settle in the grate, and reflecting upon all that the case had shown me of the strange, entangled workings of conscience and law, each pulling in its own direction, and neither, it seemed to me, entirely sufficient without the other. "It seems to me, Holmes," I said at last, "that law and justice do not always travel the same road. The law protected Sir Matthew's silence, though justice, I think, condemned it. And it was mercy, in the end, that built whatever bridge existed between the two. Mercy shown to Carstairs and to Rudge, by men who might have pressed their advantage further had they chosen. You put it well, Watson, as you so often do in your own quiet fashion." Holmes leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed, the firelight playing upon the sharp lines of his face. "But I would have you remember also the lesson that lies beneath the mercy, if you are ever tempted in your own writings to make a hero of Mr. Carstairs. It is not that the law is always right, Watson, for we have seen too often in our work together how imperfectly it serves the truth. Nor is it that conscience is always to be trusted above the law, for conscience, unchecked by evidence and patience, may lead a man as surely into wrong as into right. It is only this, that justice becomes most dangerous of all when a man convinces himself that his own certainty entitles him to deceive everyone else in its service. That is a game, Watson, at which even the cleverest player loses more than he can ever calculate to win." Neither of us spoke again for some while, and I remember only that the fire burned low, and that somewhere beyond our curtained window the bells of a church I could not name tolled the hour into the gathering dark of a London December.